Hello everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Ma'ale Adumim in Israel. One of the most common and most frustrating experiences in life is forgetting. We all forget, some more than others. It is possible, even likely, that forgetting becomes more common as we age. Perhaps infants forget relatively little, being as there is relatively little for them to forget. As we accumulate more and more things to remember, the clutter in the mind makes it difficult to keep track of everything. Something has to not be at the forefront, so it gets lost in the shuffle. The truly strange thing is when we forget something that really should be there, something that we actually intend to remember. Somehow, when the time comes to bring it back, it's just not there. This experience is so bizarre and yet so normal that it makes us wonder if we are really in control of our own mind. Why can't we remember whatever it is that we wish to remember? It should be right there, but it's not. Where did it go? There's no great answer to this question. Of course, it is somehow rooted in the neurons and chemicals that make the nuts and bolts of the mechanism of the brain. Something goes haywire up there and we forget. But this is really not much of an explanation. It simply restates the assumption that all mental processes are entirely functions of the physical brain. This is a virtually obligatory assumption in today's world, but nobody really has any idea if it is telling the entire story. Perhaps there is more going on than just those neurons and neurotransmitters. Perhaps forgetting has some spiritual component that is being ignored in the great quest to understand everything. This week's Parsha is called Miketz. That word means the end of, an incomplete phrase that refers to the end of a period of time that Joseph spent in jail. The transition from last week's Parsha to this week's is this single Hebrew word. At the end of last week's Parsha, Joseph had interpreted the dreams of his fellow prisoners. The cupbearer's dream was interpreted that he would be restored to his position, and that of the baker that he would be executed. Joseph put in a request with the cupbearer that he remember that he, Joseph, was stuck in jail for a crime he did not commit. These interpretations turned out to be completely accurate, but the cupbearer forgot about Joseph and he was left in jail. So ends the Parsha. This week's Parsha is at the end of the 2-year gap between the end of that Parsha and the beginning of this week's. This one also begins with the dream. It is Pharaoh's famous dream of 7 fat cows and 7 lean ones, with the lean cows eating the fat cows. The dream is repeated with stalks instead of cows. This dream and its interpretation would have great significance for the Israelites and the future of the world. When none of the interpretations offered by Pharaoh's soothsayers satisfy him, the royal cupbearer finally spoke up. He prefaced his statement by saying that he was, quote, remembering his sin today. He then recounted how he was thrown in jail with the baker and how they both dreamed disturbing dreams one night. He told how a Hebrew youth was there with them who interpreted the dreams accurately, being as what he predicted based on the dream interpretation came true. Upon hearing this, Pharaoh immediately had Joseph rushed out of jail, prepared for his fateful meeting, and told him about his dream and the lack of a proper interpretation. Joseph told Pharaoh that only God can resolve the situation for him. At that point, Pharaoh told him his dream. Joseph's interpretation was the famous prediction that the 7 fat cows or stalks represent 7 years of plenty, while the 7 lean stalks represent 7 years of famine. The swallowing up of the fat by the lean meant that the famine years would be so intense that they would cause everyone to forget the years of plenty. The fact that the symbolism was told twice in Pharaoh's dream indicated that the events were coming soon. There was no time to waste. Following this interpretation, Joseph then advised Pharaoh to appoint someone in charge of grain distribution to ensure that the famine years don't devastate the country. This person would make sure that the grain was stored safely in reserve so that there would be food to last through the years of famine. When Pharaoh heard this, he proclaimed the obvious, that there was nobody in the land wiser than this prophetic man, and that none other than him should be that person in charge of ensuring the safety of the nation. And so it was. One of the major points underscored in this whole sequence of events by the classic rabbinic commentators is the failure of the cupbearer to remember that Joseph was stuck in jail, despite the fact that Joseph specifically asked him to remember. One of the better known midrashic interpretations is that this was a kind of punishment for Joseph for putting his trust in this mere person, a lackey on the royal staff, instead of in God. The implication of this is that had he not asked the cupbearer to remember him when he was freed, things would have gone better for him. Specifically, the claim is that Joseph was left in prison another 2 years, the 2 years that the word phrase at the beginning of the Parsha introduces. Had he made no effort to have this cupbearer remember him, the cupbearer may have remembered him earlier, and Joseph would have been released earlier. While this is fairly famous as far as midrashic interpretations go, it is not without its problems. First is the obvious question of what exactly is so terrible about advocating for oneself. Was he supposed to sit there and do nothing to get himself out of this awful situation? Since when is putting in the proactive effort to do something positive for oneself or for others such a breach of religious etiquette? Second, the fact is that the cupbearer did remember him in the end. It may have taken a bit longer, but it did happen. As things turned out, the timing of his remembering was perfect. It came just as Joseph was needed to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. This timing facilitated the correct dream interpretation and Joseph ultimately being appointed the viceroy in Egypt. The rest of the story of the Israelites ending up in Egypt, the slavery and the ultimate exodus, and all that transpired as a result, was a consequence of this opportune timing. Had Joseph been released earlier, perhaps none of this would have happened, and the fate of the Israelites, the Jews, and the world would have been profoundly different. The first question is widely asked in rabbinic circles. Various answers are given, usually stressing the idea that any trust placed in mundane factors such as human efforts to get things done will result in a lack of trust in God and a corresponding sense of disappointment that things didn't work out as desired. This is not an easy outlook to accept or to live according to. It essentially devalues human efforts in favor of trust in God. Whether or not one can live according to such lofty standards is a matter of personal spiritual choice. The second question, on the other hand, is almost never asked. It is automatically assumed that the cupbearer could have remembered about Joseph earlier and could have gotten him out of jail had he spoken up. Why this is so is unclear. The cupbearer presumably could only voice his opinion at select times. That time turned out to be when no adequate interpretations were found for Pharaoh's dream. Before this, who knows if anyone would have paid attention to whatever he said about Yosef. He remembered him when the time came to remember him. But perhaps there is something else going on here. We don't know why the cupbearer forgot about Joseph for the time that he did. This is one of the quirks of the mind. He was certainly capable of remembering Joseph, since he did later on. But for that time period, for some reason, he forgot. This alone is revealing. He forgot. It is possible, though by no means definite, that his forgetting was a consequence of Joseph begging him to remember him. When this happened, perhaps, he had to shut things off because he was powerless to do anything about them anyhow. According to this, in a sense, it was Joseph's attempt to get the cupbearer to remember him that caused him to forget. Joseph overdid it, and the result was what happened. Would he have gotten out of jail earlier if the cupbearer had remembered earlier? The odds are against this, since things had to wait for the opportune time for such an unexpected outcome to come about. But there would have been at least one aspect of this story that would have been quite different. Joseph may have remained in jail for that span of time, but perhaps he wouldn't have languished in jail. When one puts all their stock in something that is dependent on something as fickle as human reliability, it is a good bet that disappointment is coming down the pipeline. This was the punishment of Joseph for what he did, if there really was any at all. Instead of merely remaining in jail and hoping for some miracle, he put himself into the emotionally vulnerable position of assuming that his release was imminent. What happened as a result was the inevitable disappointment when things don't work out as planned. We don't know why we forget things. Half the time it could be due to a glitch in the neuron network or something to that effect. But there are other times when it could be due to something else, something that is either more or less within our control. It could be because of something that takes place external to the memory network of the brain. It could be something like what happened in the story of Joseph and the cupbearer. Maybe the forgetting was a consequence of the pressure to remember. Maybe it was just too much to be expected and it had to be involuntarily dismissed. If things had been left to simply run along their unencumbered path, perhaps he would have remembered Joseph in a more timely manner. An important message of this story and the midrashic interpretation is that we set ourselves up for disappointment when we expect too much out of either ourselves or of others. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't expect ourselves or others to put forth the required effort to achieve something. Of course we should. But we should also realize that things don't always work out according to plan. And too much expectation is a perfect storm for failed expectations. The human mind is the most wonderful and most complex thing known in our world. It can span the universe in the blink of an eye and can penetrate to the depths of itself or the mind of another if it wishes. But it is also subject to failure at the slightest whim. Whether it be forgetting for some crazy reason or no reason at all, or the emotional roller coasters of hope and disappointment, it is all there waiting for us. It is not easy to be the home of such a divine instrument. But that is our task, and we all must learn to live with it. Shabbat Shalom.